Just minutes ago, the courtroom doors closed and a decision was delivered that no one inside the British royal family expected to hear out loud. After months of legal tension and whispered speculation, judges issued a ruling that could permanently reshape the legacy of Princess Diana. Prince Harry's challenge, his final attempt to alter the interpretation of his mother's will, has been officially rejected. And according to the court, the document contains a clause that legally excludes his family. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The words of the ruling were calm, precise, and unmistakably final. Yet the meaning behind them carried the force of a thunderclap. For months, rumors had quietly circulated among legal observers and royal insiders that something unusual was unfolding behind closed doors. An obscure legal battle centered around the will of Princess Diana. Most people assumed the dispute would fade quietly into the background, like so many royal matters before it. But instead, the case grew into something far more explosive, a confrontation between interpretation and legacy, between the past Diana left behind and the future her sons believed they deserved. Prince Harry's legal team had entered the challenge with determination, convinced that the interpretation of the will had been misunderstood for decades. According to those close to the proceedings, the argument was simple but emotionally charged. They believed a controversial clause buried deep within the document had been applied far more strictly than Diana ever intended. To Harry and his lawyers, the wording suggested flexibility, an intention to protect the monarchy during uncertain years, rather than permanently exclude any branch of her family. But the opposing legal interpretation was far colder. It insisted the clause had always been clear, written deliberately, and designed to protect a very specific vision of Diana's legacy. Lawyers scrutinized the phrasing, the timing of its drafting, and the legal advice Diana received during the final months of her life. Witnesses were consulted. Historical records were examined. What seemed like a routine estate matter slowly transformed into something far more emotionally charged, because behind the legal arguments stood the fragile memory of a woman who had captured the world's heart. Princess Diana had always been seen as the mother who loved both of her sons fiercely and equally. The suggestion that her will might favor one branch of the family over another felt almost impossible to reconcile with that image. And yet, as the judges explained their decision, the courtroom was forced to confront a difficult truth. The clause existed. Its wording was precise. And according to the court's interpretation, it created legal boundaries that could not simply be brushed aside. The ruling confirmed that inheritance rights tied to Diana's estate would follow conditions established within the will itself, conditions that legally restricted the future claims of Harry's immediate family line. The exclusion, the judges made clear, was not symbolic, not theoretical, and certainly not temporary. It was binding. Inside royal circles, the emotional shock was immediate. Palace insiders had long feared that this moment might come, that the quiet legal dispute would eventually surface in a way that forced the monarchy to confront uncomfortable questions about Diana's intentions. Some believed the ruling would reopen old wounds between members of the royal family. Others worried about the global reaction, knowing that Diana's legacy remains deeply personal to millions of people who still view her as the people's princess. For Prince Harry, however, the ruling carried a different weight entirely. This was not merely a legal defeat. It was a deeply personal moment in which a document written by his own mother appeared to draw a line between his future and the legacy she left behind. Whether Diana ever intended such a consequence remains a question that historians and royal watchers may debate for years to come. But in the eyes of the law, the judges had spoken. The clause stood, the exclusion remained. Almost immediately, new questions began to circulate beyond the courtroom walls. If Harry's family line was legally restricted, then who exactly benefits from Diana's estate under the clause? What long-term vision had guided the creation of such a provision? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why had this part of the will remained largely hidden from public discussion for so many years? The ruling may have delivered legal clarity, but it also opened a door to deeper mysteries surrounding the final decisions Princess Diana made about her legacy. But to understand how a courtroom ruling today could ignite such a storm inside the royal family, we have to travel back nearly 3 decades to the moment Princess Diana first decided to write the document that would become one of the most controversial royal wills ever created. In the months before her tragic death, Princess Diana was reportedly re-evaluating everything: her role, her relationships, and the legacy she would leave behind. Friends say she became increasingly focused on protecting what she believed mattered most. During this period, a quiet meeting with legal advisors led to a decision that few understood at the time, a decision that would plant the seeds for the legal explosion unfolding today. To many observers, the story of Diana's will did not begin with conflict. It began with conflict, reflection. During those final months, people close to her noticed subtle changes in the way she spoke about the future. The public still saw the confident humanitarian, admired around the world, but behind closed doors, Diana was said to be thinking far beyond the present moment. Her sons were growing older, their lives were becoming increasingly complicated, and the institution surrounding them, the monarchy itself, was entering a period of profound uncertainty. Diana understood that the decisions she made about her estate would not simply distribute wealth, they would shape the long-term security of the two boys she loved more than anything. According to individuals familiar with the drafting process, Diana began reassessing her estate plans with unusual seriousness. She asked questions that went far beyond simple inheritance. Who would control certain assets? How could the financial resources she left behind protect her sons from pressures she believed might one day surround them? These were not easy conversations, but Diana insisted on having them. Her legal advisors reportedly worked closely with her to restructure key elements of the will, ensuring that the document reflected both her personal wishes and the complicated realities of royal life. As those discussions progressed, several revisions quietly appeared within the document. Some were routine adjustments, technical language designed to clarify the distribution of money, property, and personal possessions, but others carried deeper implications. New clauses began to shape the structure of the inheritance itself. These provisions were carefully written, framed in the precise language of legal protection. At first glance, they appeared straightforward. Yet the more closely lawyers examined them, the clearer it became that Diana had inserted conditions tied to the responsibilities and roles her sons might hold in the monarchy. One particular clause stood out even during the drafting process. It outlined protections related to inheritance rights and future generations, linking certain benefits to the preservation of royal duties and institutional alignment. At the time, however, the clause did not attract public attention. In fact, very few people outside the legal circle surrounding Diana even knew it existed. To those involved in preparing the will, the language reflected a mother trying to safeguard the future, while also respecting the fragile balance of a centuries-old institution. Behind that careful wording lay deeper concerns. Some insiders would later suggest that Diana worried about forces that might one day surround her son's pressures from outside the royal structure, influences that could complicate the stability she hoped they would maintain. The idea of future spouses and extended family dynamics reportedly crossed her mind more than once. Diana had experienced firsthand how relationships could reshape the monarchy in ways no one predicted. If the institution was to remain stable, she believed the framework of her estate might need to provide certain guardrails. When the will was finally completed, the document quietly entered the legal system with little public scrutiny. Its clauses were sealed, its instructions carried out according to established procedures. After Diana's death, the estate was administered with the kind of quiet efficiency that often surrounds royal matters. There was grief across the world, endless tributes, and an outpouring of emotion that overshadowed any detailed examination of legal paperwork. For years, the will remained exactly where it had been placed, secure within archives, rarely discussed and almost never questioned. Yet hidden within those pages was the clause that would eventually ignite controversy decades later. At the time of its creation, it seemed like a precaution, one mother's attempt to protect both her children and the institution that defined their lives. No one could have predicted how dramatically its meaning would be tested in the years ahead. And as the monarchy evolved, relationships shifted, and Prince Harry's path diverged from the traditional royal structure. That once forgotten clause slowly began to take on new significance. For years, the clause remained buried within legal archives, rarely discussed and almost never questioned, until the moment Prince Harry decided to challenge the interpretation that would ultimately define his family's place in Diana's legacy. For Prince Harry, the decision to challenge the interpretation of Diana's will was not taken lightly. Behind the scenes, it followed years of frustration, legal consultations, and emotional reflection. According to sources close to the situation, Harry believed the clause had been misunderstood, or perhaps deliberately interpreted in a way that undermined his family's rightful place within Diana's legacy. The question that began quietly soon became impossible for him to ignore. For years, the controversial clause had existed in the background, like a locked door no one wanted to open. But as Harry's life moved further away from the traditional structure of the monarchy, the meaning of that clause began to change. What once looked like a distant legal technicality slowly transformed into something far more personal. Every discussion about Diana's legacy, every reference to the future of her estate, seemed to circle back to the same unsettling idea that the wording of her will might draw a line between the two branches of her family. According to individuals familiar with Harry's thinking during this period, the issue began with questions rather than accusations. Harry reportedly wanted to understand how the clause H had come to be interpreted so strictly. Had the language truly been intended to exclude his family permanently, or had it been written as a temporary protection during a time when the monarchy itself was under intense scrutiny? These questions led him to consult legal experts who specialized in estate law and royal financial structures. They examined the document carefully, line by line, searching for nuance within the precise language Diana's advisors had crafted decades earlier. What they discovered was both intriguing and troubling. The clause was undeniably complex, written in a way that allowed for interpretation depending on how one viewed Diana's intentions at the time. Harry's lawyers believed the wording contained enough ambiguity to justify a challenge. In their view, the clause could reasonably be understood as a safeguard designed to protect the stability of the monarchy during uncertain years, not as a permanent exclusion that would extend to Harry's future children and generations beyond. This interpretation became the foundation of Harry's legal strategy. His team argued that any evaluation of the will had to consider more than just the literal wording. It had to reflect the spirit of Diana herself. She had always spoken openly about her love for both of her sons, often describing them as the center of her world. To Harry's lawyers, it seemed almost unimaginable that she would intentionally create a legal structure that favored one son's lineage over the other. The challenge, therefore, was not simply about money or inheritance. It was about the meaning of Diana's final decisions as a mother. For Harry, the case soon evolved into something deeply emotional. The legal arguments became intertwined with his determination to protect the future of his own children. If the clause remained unchallenged, the consequences could echo for generations. The idea that Diana's estate might formally exclude his family carried a symbolic weight that extended far beyond financial matters. It touched on identity, belonging, and the fragile connection between the past Diana left behind and the future her grandchildren would inherit. But pursuing the challenge came with risks. Royal observers warned that reopening the interpretation of Diana's will could ignite tensions already simmering within the royal family. The monarchy had long depended on a delicate balance of tradition and silence. By bringing the matter into the courtroom, Harry was forcing a private document into public scrutiny. Some believed the move was courageous, an attempt to defend what he saw as fairness. Others feared it could deepen divisions that had been quietly growing for years. Still, Harry pressed forward. After months of consultations, legal drafts, and difficult reflection, he reached a conclusion that would define the next chapter of the story. The clause needed to be tested, not whispered about behind palace walls, not debated quietly among advisors, but examined openly in the place where interpretation ultimately becomes law. For Harry, challenging the clause was no longer optional. It had become a matter of principle, an effort to ensure that Diana's legacy remained connected to all of her descendants. But once the legal challenge entered the courtroom, the focus shifted from emotion to something far colder and far less forgiving: the precise language of Diana's will. As lawyers began dissecting Diana's will line by line, one paragraph quickly emerged as the centerpiece of the case. A clause written in careful legal language but carrying enormous implications for the royal family's future. What it said and how it was written would ultimately determine whether Prince Harry's challenge stood any chance of success. At first glance, the paragraph did not appear dramatic. It was not emotional. It carried none of the warmth that people associated with Diana herself. Instead, it was constructed with the cold precision of legal architecture, structured sentences, defined conditions, and language designed to eliminate uncertainty. But as the lawyers leaned deeper into its wording, the true gravity of the clause began to unfold. Hidden within that carefully crafted paragraph was a framework that connected inheritance rights directly to royal duty. The message embedded in the language was subtle but powerful. Diana's estate was not meant to exist independently from the institution that shaped her life. It was meant to reinforce it. The clause outlined a structure that linked financial inheritance and symbolic assets to alignment with the monarchy's formal responsibilities. In practical terms, it meant that beneficiaries and even their descendants would receive access to certain portions of Diana's estate only under conditions tied to royal status and institutional commitment. At the time the will was written, such language might have seemed like nothing more than a safeguard. Diana had lived through a turbulent period in royal history, and the monarchy itself was navigating public scrutiny and internal strain. To many legal observers, the clause appeared to reflect a desire for stability, a protective measure designed to ensure that the legacy she left behind would strengthen the royal structure rather than weaken it. But decades later, that same wording now carried far more complicated consequences. Because if inheritance rights were connected to institutional alignment, then the definition of that alignment became the central issue of the entire case. Lawyers representing Harry argued that the clause should not be interpreted as a permanent boundary. They insisted the wording contained layers of ambiguity phrases that allowed room for context, interpretation, and evolving circumstances. Diana, they argued, could not possibly have predicted the complex path her younger son's life would eventually take. Therefore, the clause should be read through the lens of her intentions as a mother, not solely through the rigid mechanics of legal phrasing. Opposing counsel saw things very differently. To them, the wording was anything but ambiguous. They emphasized that Diana had been advised by experienced legal professionals when drafting the document, and that every sentence had been carefully constructed to avoid misinterpretation. If the clause appeared strict, it was because it had been designed that way from the beginning. The lawyers defending the existing interpretation argued that Diana understood precisely what she was doing, linking her estate to the enduring structure of the monarchy so that her legacy would remain anchored within it. As the hearing progressed, the courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Every argument returned to the same paragraph. Every legal theory circled back to the same handful of sentences. The case, which had initially seemed complex and wide-ranging, slowly narrowed until it revolved around a single question. What exactly had Diana intended when she approved that clause? Observers watching the proceedings could sense the weight of the moment. Because this was no longer simply a matter of legal interpretation, it had become a confrontation between two visions of Diana herself. One vision portrayed her as a mother whose love for her sons would never allow such a division. The other suggested she had also been a strategic thinker who understood that protecting the monarchy might require difficult decisions. The words on the page did not offer easy answers. Instead, they created a puzzle that demanded interpretation. And as the arguments concluded, all eyes turned toward the one group of people whose interpretation would matter more than anyone else's. And when the judges finally examined the clause themselves, their interpretation would ignite one of the most emotionally charged decisions the royal courts have delivered in years. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense long before the judges entered. Lawyers on both sides understood the stakes were enormous, not just financially, but emotionally and historically. What began as a technical legal dispute had evolved into something much larger, a confrontation between two interpretations of Princess Diana's legacy. The silence inside the chamber carried a strange weight. It was the kind of quiet that forms when everyone understands that something bigger than legal paperwork is about to unfold. For the lawyers representing Prince Harry, this moment represented the culmination of months of preparation, research, and emotional conviction. Their argument rested on a belief that the court must look beyond rigid legal structures and instead consider the woman behind the document. Diana was not simply a figure of law and protocol. She was a mother, a protector, a woman who had spoken again and again about the love she felt for both of her sons. Harry's legal team leaned heavily on that reality, insisting that any interpretation of the will must reflect the emotional truth of Diana's life rather than only the literal construction of her words. Their argument unfolded slowly, but with growing intensity. They reminded the court that Diana had lived through an extraordinary chapter in royal history, one marked by upheaval, public scrutiny, and deeply personal struggles. In such an environment, it was entirely possible that protective clauses had been written to address temporary circumstances rather than permanent family divisions. According to Harry's lawyers, the controversial clause "hold" be viewed through that lens, a precaution perhaps, a defensive structure designed to preserve stability during uncertain years. But not, they insisted, an irreversible exclusion that would echo across generations of Diana's descendants. Opposing counsel responded with a very different tone, calm, deliberate, and rooted in strict legal principle. Their argument was built on a simple premise. The court's responsibility was not to interpret emotions. It was to interpret language. Diana's will, they emphasized, had been drafted by experienced professionals who understood precisely how inheritance law functioned. The document had been reviewed, refined, and finalized through a process intended to eliminate confusion. If the clause appeared firm, it was because it had been written to be firm. According to their position, the meaning of the words could not simply be reshaped decades later based on assumptions about Diana's feelings. As the debate intensified, the judges began asking questions that cut straight to the heart of the matter. They pressed Harry's legal team to explain exactly where ambiguity existed within the clause. If the wording allowed reinterpretation, they wanted to know precisely which phrases created that flexibility. At the same time, they questioned the opposing lawyers about Diana's intentions during the drafting process. Did historical records offer insight into why the clause had been structured the way it was? Had any correspondence or advisory notes revealed the reasoning behind the language? Gradually, fragments of the past began to surface within the courtroom discussion. Legal documents from the original drafting process were presented. Notes from consultations between Diana and her advisors were examined. The more the history of the will emerged, the clearer the stakes became. This was no longer merely a theoretical debate. It was a reconstruction of Diana's final legal decisions. Decisions made during a time when she was balancing her identity as both a mother and a figure tied to a centuries-old institution. Yet even as those details surfaced, the deeper tension remained unresolved. The courtroom was witnessing a clash between two fundamentally different philosophies. On one side stood the argument that law must reflect human intention and emotional context. On the other stood the belief that legal clarity must always prevail over interpretation. The more the arguments unfolded, the more it seemed that the judges were gravitating toward the latter. Their questions became sharper, their focus returned again and again to the precise wording of the clause itself. Observers in the courtroom could sense the shift. The momentum of the case was subtly changing direction. What had begun as an emotionally charged attempt to reinterpret Diana's legacy now faced the rigid gravity of legal precision, and as the final arguments concluded, the fate of Harry's challenge rested entirely in the hands of the judges, three figures tasked with deciding whether the spirit of Diana's life could alter the letter of her law. And then, after weeks of deliberation, the judges delivered the ruling that would send shockwaves through both the courtroom and the royal family itself. When the presiding judge began reading the decision, the room reportedly fell silent. Every word mattered. Every phrase carried consequences for one of the most famous families in the world, and within moments, it became clear that Prince Harry's legal gamble had failed. The ruling did not arrive with theatrical language or emotional commentary. Instead, it unfolded in the steady cadence of judicial certainty. The presiding judge carefully outlined the reasoning behind the court's decision, returning again and again to the same central principle. The court's responsibility was not to speculate about emotions or reinterpret intentions. Its responsibility was to interpret the document as it had been written. And according to the judges, the document left little room for doubt. The controversial clause that had dominated weeks of legal argument was declared legally valid and enforceable. The language, the court explained, was structured with precision and clarity, while the wording carried complexity. It did not contain the level of ambiguity required to justify altering its meaning. The judges emphasized that the clause established clear conditions regarding inheritance rights tied to the estate of Princess Diana. Those conditions, they concluded, restricted how certain assets and benefits could pass through future generations. For Harry's legal team, the moment was devastating. Their entire argument had rested on the belief that the clause could be interpreted differently when examined within the emotional context of Diana's life. They had argued that the spirit of her intentions as a mother should guide the court's understanding of the will, but the judges made it clear that such considerations, however compelling they might appear, could not override the structure of the document itself. As the ruling continued, the language became even more direct. The court confirmed that the clause effectively limited inheritance rights connected to Harry's immediate family line. The conditions established within Diana's will, they explained, were binding under the law governing estate administration. The judges stressed that their role was not to reshape Diana's decisions, but to respect them exactly as they had been written. In other words, the court was not rewriting history, it was enforcing it. Then came the sentence that closed the chapter Harry had spent months trying to change. His challenge was formally rejected. The legal effort to reinterpret the clause had failed. With that single declaration, the case that had stirred so much speculation and emotion reached its official conclusion, yet the impact of those words stretched far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Because the ruling did more than settle a legal argument, it redefined the future of Diana's estate and the way her legacy would be carried forward through generations. The distribution structure she had created decades earlier would remain exactly as she had written it, including the restrictions that now stood at the center of global attention. Within minutes, the reaction began spreading across royal watchers, legal analysts, and observers around the world. The decision confirmed what they had suspected all along, that Diana's will contained a deliberate design meant to reinforce a specific vision of royal continuity. For others, the ruling felt deeply unsettling, raising questions about whether the law had fully captured the spirit of the woman whose memory still resonates with millions. But perhaps the most powerful reaction was the one that could not be measured by headlines or commentary, because behind the legal language stood the human reality of the decision. For Prince Harry, the ruling was not just the conclusion of a courtroom battle. It was the final confirmation that a document written by his mother now carried consequences for his own children's place within her legacy. And while the judges had delivered their verdict with calm authority, the emotional impact of the decision was only beginning to unfold. The legal chapter might have closed, but the story surrounding Diana's will had entered an entirely new phase, one that would ripple through royal relationships, public perception, and the fragile dynamics of the family she left behind. But the courtroom decision was only the beginning, because its consequences would soon ripple far beyond legal documents and into the fragile emotional balance of the royal family itself. Within hours of the ruling, the story spread across the world. Headlines exploded, analysts debated, but inside royal circles, the reaction was far more personal. The court's decision had reopened wounds that many believed would never fully heal. The ruling did not exist in isolation. It landed in the middle of relationships that had already been strained by years of distance, misunderstanding, and public scrutiny. For members of the royal family, the decision was more than a legal conclusion. It was a moment that forced everyone to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality about Diana's legacy. What had once been remembered as a bond between a mother and her two sons was now being examined through the unforgiving lens of legal interpretation. And for those closest to the situation, the emotional consequences were impossible to ignore. Inside palace circles, conversations reportedly turned cautious and reflective. Some individuals believed the ruling had exposed a painful misunderstanding rather than an intentional division. They argued that Diana's will had been written during a turbulent chapter in royal history, when the monarchy itself was under immense pressure. According to this view, the clause that now stood at the center of controversy may have been designed as a protective measure rather than a statement of preference. Diana, they insisted, would never have imagined that decades later her words would become a source of conflict between her own sons But not everyone shared that interpretation. Other voices within royal circles suggested that Diana had been far more deliberate in her thinking than many people realized. She had lived within the monarchy long enough to understand how fragile the institution could be. If she structured her estate in a way that favored stability within the royal framework, these observers argued it might have reflected her desire to protect the crown itself. In that sense, the clause might not have been about choosing between her sons. Instead, it could have been about preserving a vision of continuity that she believed would safeguard the future of the monarchy. As these interpretations circulated quietly among insiders, the wider world reacted with fascination and disbelief. The emotional impact of the ruling quickly became a global conversation. Supporters of Prince Harry expressed sympathy, questioning whether the strict legal interpretation had overshadowed the compassionate spirit people associated with Diana. They argued that the idea of her grandchildren being excluded from part of her legacy seemed deeply inconsistent with the warmth she had always shown as a mother. Others took a very different view. For them, the ruling confirmed something they believed had always been true, that Diana had carefully designed her estate to support the institutional stability of the monarchy. They pointed out that royal history is filled with examples of personal sacrifices made in the name of continuity. If Diana had structured her will with similar intentions, they argued, the court's decision was simply respecting the responsibility she had carried as a member of the royal family. The result was a sharp divide in public opinion. Commentators, historians, and royal observers began dissecting every available detail of the will, searching for clues about what Diana might truly have intended. Some focused on her famous devotion to her sons, insisting that such devotion could never produce the kind of exclusion the court had recognized. Others looked at her life within the monarchy and concluded that she understood better than anyone the difficult balance between personal love and institutional duty. Meanwhile, at the center of the storm remained the human reality of the ruling. For Prince Harry and his family, the court's decision had transformed a decades-old document into something deeply immediate and personal. The clause that had once seemed like distant legal language now carried emotional weight that would inevitably shape the way Diana's legacy touched future generations. Yet, as the debate continued to unfold, scholars and historians began examining the will with renewed intensity, and as they studied its wording more closely, another possibility began to emerge, one that suggested the story might still hold an unexpected twist. And yet, as historians began studying the document more closely, a final question emerged, one that could change how Diana's decision is remembered forever. Was the clause truly meant to exclude Prince Harry's family, or was it simply Diana's attempt to safeguard something she believed was fragile? As experts continue analyzing the will, many believe the document reveals more about Diana's fears and hopes than anyone realized at the time. For decades, Princess Diana has existed in public memory as a figure defined by compassion, empathy, and fierce devotion to her children. That image has never faded. Even today, long after her passing, millions still view her as a mother who challenged royal tradition in order to protect the emotional lives of her sons. Yet the court ruling has forced a difficult question into the open. If Diana loved both of her sons with equal intensity, why would her will contain a clause that appears to draw a boundary between their family lines? Historians and royal scholars now find themselves returning to the document with fresh eyes. What they see is not simply a legal structure, but a reflection of the extraordinary tension that shaped Diana's life. She lived at the crossroads of two powerful entities. On one side stood her role as a mother, deeply protective, emotionally driven, and determined to give her sons a childhood filled with warmth and independence. On the other side stood the expectations of the monarchy, an institution built on centuries of continuity, hierarchy, and responsibility. Diana spent years navigating that delicate balance, often walking a path that few before her had dared to attempt. When experts examine the controversial clause within that context, a more complicated picture begins to emerge. Some believe the language reveals Diana wrestling with the same conflict that defined much of her life. She may have been trying to protect her sons while also ensuring that the royal structure surrounding them remained stable. The wording of the clause linking inheritance conditions to royal responsibilities suggests that she understood how fragile the monarchy could become during times of personal upheaval. Her estate, therefore, may have been designed to reinforce that stability. Others see the clause differently. They argue that the language might not represent exclusion at all but caution, a legal safeguard written during a period when Diana herself was navigating uncertain ground. In this interpretation, the clause was not meant to divide the family, but to create guardrails that would guide the future of her estate. If circumstances changed dramatically over time, as they often do within royal life, the structure of the will would still protect the broader legacy she hoped to leave behind. The debate reveals something deeply human about Diana's final decisions. She was not writing her will from a place of perfect clarity. She was a woman living through an emotionally complicated chapter of her life, trying to anticipate a future that no one could fully predict. The monarchy was evolving, public expectations were shifting, and her sons were rowing into roles that would carry enormous pressure. Within that uncertainty, Diana attempted to shape a legacy that would endure beyond her lifetime. The court ruling has now transformed that legacy into something even more complex. By confirming the legal strength of the clause, the judges have forced historians, commentators, and the public to reconsider what Diana might have intended. Was she protecting the institution she had once struggled against? Was she building a safeguard for her sons' futures? Or was she simply trying to reconcile two parts of her identity that never fully aligned? What makes the story so powerful is that the answers may never be completely certain. Diana's will, like much of her life, exists within the space between emotion and duty, and perhaps that is why the document continues to captivate the world even decades later, because it reminds us that behind the titles, the ceremonies and the headlines, the royal family is still shaped by human choices made and remembered long after the moment has passed. And as the dust settles on Prince Harry's rejected challenge, the story of Diana's will may still hold one final lesson about legacy, loyalty, and the complicated weight of royal history. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.